VG101 started in 2019 as a project for my field production class in college. It was originally just supposed to be informational, but I've started to add some jokes here and there, slowly but surely. You know, some of my recent videos have started to gain some real traction, and I've just recently passed 100 subscribers. So to celebrate that, and to show some of the new viewers what VG101 originally was, I decided to make this video. So thank you for watching VG101 Season 1. Video games. A timeless source of entertainment that has done nothing but progress and evolve over the years. Through video games, we have been told incredible stories, been thrusted into the shoes of heroes, and even met some friends along the way. As we enter the world where video games are becoming more and more realistic and beginning to tackle all of our senses, it's important that we know just how far video games have come. To do that, we have to travel back to the beginning. But where does the beginning begin? What is the first video game? It's a debate that is as old as digital entertainment itself, and it's my mission to solve that debate once and for all on the premiere episode of VG101. Good day, class. I'm your host, the VG Professor, and on today's episode, I'll be presenting to you the 4 games that can all, for very different reasons, be considered the first video game. To start, we'll have to travel all the way back to 1947 and take a look at the cathode ray tube amusement device. In the 1940s, 2 physicists named Thomas T. Goldsmith Jr. and Cecil Ray Mann specialized in the development of cathode ray tubes and their ability to read electronic signal outputs. They came up with the idea for a game that would involve a cathode ray tube, an oscilloscope, some knobs, and an overlay for the oscilloscope that had targets drawn onto it. They would submit a patent for the device in 1947, making it the first electronic game patented. The objective of the game was to use the knobs that control the light traces made by the cathode ray tube displayed on the oscilloscope to hit the targets that were drawn onto the overlay. Unfortunately, to show you guys how this would work would be a little unsafe considering what goes into powering these things, but luckily by using some fairly newer technology, we have a way to work around that. So the cathode ray tube that we have here can be better demonstrated using an actual oscilloscope. Please keep in mind though that this oscilloscope is digital, whereas the original cathode ray tube amusement device would be a completely analog contraption. So just remember that whenever we go back to the arguments for and against the cathode ray tube amusement device. So we have this hand-drawn overlay on a piece of paper that we're just going to tape right here over the screen of the oscilloscope. Those little dots will be our targets. So what we've done here is we've taken a D battery, we're clipping one wire that's attached to the oscilloscope to one part of it, and then using this other wire to touch the other part. That's what's making this light trace move. This, in a way, mimics what the knobs of the cathode ray tube amusement device would be doing. After taking a look at how the cathode ray tube amusement device would be played, it's time to look at the arguments for and against it being considered the first video game. The arguments in favor of the cathode ray tube amusement device are that the game is displayed on a screen via the oscilloscope, and regardless of what we inevitably end up defining as a video game, it is the very first interactive electronic game. The arguments against it are that the game is run purely by analog hardware. Once again, the demonstration in the lab was just that, a demonstration. So no real digital computing, and the game was never replicated despite its patent. So even though it was made for amusement, the general public never got to be amused by it, much like we see with all video games today. With the cathode ray tube amusement device explained, we can now move on to our next contender, Bertie the Brain. Created by Joseph Cates for the 1950 Canadian National Exhibition, Bertie the Brain was essentially a 13-foot tall tic-tac-toe machine designed for the purpose of displaying the invention more important to Cates, the Additron tube. This was a miniature version of a vacuum tube that he hoped would be beneficial to computer development, but shortly after its debut the transistor surpassed it. Bertie the Brain was played at this exhibition by many people by pressing one of 9 lit buttons on a panel that would decide their moves. Bertie, using actual computer software, would come up with its move next, making this the first electronic game where you compete against a form of computer software. Bertie even sported an adjustable difficulty between easy, medium, and hard. Bertie the Brain was dismantled a few weeks after the exhibition as
Cates didn't have time to deal with the upkeep of it, and he wanted the parts for things that he deemed more useful. So, with no chance of us playing the original model, and absolutely no chance of me building a 13-foot tall piece of hardware, I've prepared a fairly accurate representation for us. Playing a game of Google Tic-Tac-Toe on a giant projector. This may be overkill, but it does a good job of emphasizing Birdie's size and the sense of awe that people had when they were playing it.
One of the stark differences between this version of Tic-Tac-Toe and Birdie was that Birdie wasn't shown on a display screen. It actually used a more analog technology for the display, allowing light bulbs to turn on and off within the machine to light up and show what move you've made.
Now that we've sort of got a sense of what Birdie the Brain was like, let's go over the arguments for and against Birdie the Brain being the first video game.
The arguments for Birdie the Brain are: Tic-Tac-Toe is a definitive game, video or not, and Birdie uses digital computing to play against the human player. The arguments against Birdie the Brain are no actual video display and made purely to demonstrate new technology. It's for these reasons that if Birdie is the first, we consider Nimrod the second, since they have the same arguments.
The last point I made about Birdie the Brain, the one about it being made for the sake of demonstrating technology rather than being made for fun, puts us to a philosophical debate and asks us the question, how do we define a game? That philosophical question is important in discussing the arguments between our next two games.
The first of these two we'll be looking at focuses on the technological advancement side of our philosophical argument, and it's simply a computer game of draughts, or checkers if you live in the United States. Developed by British scientist Christopher Strachey, Draughts was the first of a series of real-world board games starting in 1952, developed into digital form for the sake of further studying programming, computer algorithms, and the interactions between humans and computers. Before we continue, I'd like to point out that A.S. Douglas's OXO was released around the same time and has a lot of the same arguments, but since the dates on both are a little muddy and we've already covered a tic-tac-toe game, I'm going with Draughts for this part of the argument. Well, it's checkers. There's not much I can say about this game besides what we already know about the classic board game. Essentially what you do with Christopher Strachey's Draughts program is just do what I'm doing here. Put in your inputs on a keypad and see them displayed on the screen. There's not much difference here, and there's really not that much to show. With Draughts demonstrated, let's get into the arguments for and against it. The arguments for Draughts: it uses a digital computing software, and it displays on a CRT screen. By all means, from a technical standpoint, it has all the qualifications of being a video game. The argument against it: it was made purely for technological advancement and not for fun.
Now we move on to our final contender. Once again, this is the part of the debate that gets philosophical and asks us the question, what do we count as being a video game? Something that you can play purely for the sake of showing off the rise in technology, or something that you play for fun?
In 1958, Brookhaven National Laboratory in Upton, New York was having its annual tour, which consisted of 1 day for college students to tour, 1 day for high school students, and 1 day for the general public. Fearing that the students would actually get bored when viewing the laboratory, physicist William Higginbottom created Tennis for Two. Higginbottom also worked on the Manhattan Project, so we know this guy's legit. The game was made so that the students could have fun while at the laboratory, displayed on an oscilloscope, and even use controllers.
Unfortunately, like the rest of our contenders, Tennis for Two wasn't commercially released and was dismantled shortly after so that the parts could be put to more important use. But luckily, we were actually able to recreate the game with all the appropriate parts. Let's head back to the lab so we can demonstrate Tennis for Two.
When I say we built Tennis for Two, I really mean that we built it. What you're seeing right here is a board that we've wired up to basically become a digital to analog converter, and right there is the microcontroller which we're going to program with the Tennis for Two program. This is simply us running the program. And that right there is the programmer that I got to solder up, which is going to run that signal into the microcontroller. This is the head for one of our controllers with a potentiometer and a button. Here I am soldering the wires that are going inside of the controller. And we're just going to put the top right on the box. Next up is wiring the controller up to the board. And as you can see there, now that everything's connected through BNC cables, we can see the display on the screen. Alright, I'd like to introduce you guys to Eric Costa. One of the engineers has been helping me build this contraption, and right here is our finished product of Tennis for Two. Now, Eric, you and I are about to play a game, aren't we?
Yes, let's do it. Let's test it out.
The game is pretty simple in concept. You play a game of tennis. One player starts with the ball on their side, they knock it over to the other player's side, then the other player knocks it back. The capacity of the ground and the net are both pretty impressive, as you're able to bounce off the ground and you can even get your ball stuck on the net, giving the other player the point. On the subject of points, the game doesn't keep score, so if you're playing this with a friend, just keep score in your head, on a piece of paper, or whatever. As for the controls, the knob on the controller controls the angle in which you hit the ball, and the button of course hits the ball for you. One complaint that I have for the game is that it takes forever for the ball to respawn. That thing either has to completely stop bouncing, or it has to go all the way off the screen before you're able to restart the game. All in all, for a game that was built in the late 1950s, it's pretty innovative and honestly, a lot of fun. Now that we've seen the game in action, let's review the arguments for and against Tennis for Two. It's pretty cut and dry when you look at the arguments for this game. It uses digital computing, uses a CRT display, and is made for the purpose of having fun. The arguments against it? It was made after Draughts already accomplished points 1 and 2. With all the candidates played and all the arguments reviewed, this is the part where you guys come in. At the end of the video, you'll see 4 links, each corresponding to one of the 4 games I've presented to you. Click on the link for the game you think should be considered the first video game, and we will reveal the answer on the next episode of VG 101. Good morning, class. I'm sorry I don't look as professional as I did the last time we met, but I wanted to dress a little more comfortable, because even though this is only our second class together, I think it's about time that we took a field trip. This field trip is going to be one like no other, as we're driving and flying cross-country so that we can play one of the most influential video games of all time, Space War. Space War was developed in 1962 by computer scientists at MIT for the newly installed PDP-1 computer. The popularity that Space War had amongst programmers inspired ports of the game at different colleges and helped to inspire those who would later on seek to cash in on the popularity of playing a game on a screen. We have made it to our destination, Mountain View, California, and if you look behind me, we'll be taking a look inside the Computer History Museum to talk to a man who has something to say about the PDP-1 computer and the video game Space War. We are here today with a man who could be considered one of the founding fathers of video games, the man who made Space War, Mr. Steve Russell. Steve, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, when we were talking earlier, you had a slight objection to founding father of video game. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Well, when Space War was written, there was no notion of video games. And in fact, it was about 10 years later that computers and displays got cheap enough so that they could be considered to be put in an arcade, and eventually people did. And then the idea of calling them video games came up because they were all using video monitors, which Space War never knew about.
So with that being said, what would you consider Space War? Because it is a game.
A computer game.
Could you tell us a little bit about how the PDP-1 works?
The PDP-1 was the first computer that I ever met that had a display on it as a standard feature and had a power switch that I could touch. I had been working for several years on the big IBM systems, which at the time were vacuum tube. They were just beginning to be transistorized. But here the PDP-1 had a typewriter right there connected. And very, very soon after it arrived, a committee of students had made an interactive system that allowed you to debug your program in terms of the symbols you would use for writing it rather than just raw numbers. And the combination of doing that and doing it on a typewriter which responded instantly seemed like much more exciting thing to do than sit there and decode large volumes of numbers. So I kind of wanted to use that. And it looked like with the display you could do something interesting. The space race was very much in the news at the time. And so we decided that, I decided and promoted the idea that, you could probably write a spaceship trainer for it. So somebody ought to write something to train people how to fly a spaceship. And they could do it on this computer, and it would be fun. The part that I did was what I would consider a plain vanilla programming project. There were a couple of things that were needed to be collected beforehand. One was I needed sine and cosine routines and square root routine. And I didn't have to write them, they were available. And in fact, the sine cosine routine was the cause of some of the embarrassment because I was ceremonially presented with the sine and cosine routines by Ellen Kotok, who said, here's the sine and cosine routines, now what's your excuse? I didn't have one, so I had to write some code, and I had to figure out how to display spaceships that rotated smoothly.
How was Space War received whenever you had finished it and people were able to play it? Did people enjoy it?
Space War was probably one of the first computer games where people actually came back to play it again. Because a lot of the earlier ones were demonstrations, but oh, that's nice. But, you know, tic-tac-toe doesn't have a high repeat value. We did bias things a little in favor of tactics rather than just shoot 'em up. So there's a real benefit to understanding something about orbits and something about strategy, like not wasting your fuel and torpedoes when your opponent isn't a good target. And so there are some things to figure out, and there are some things to practice.
So now that we've talked about how Space War is played, I just want to let you know that I've actually never played it. I've never done any kind of emulation of it, never played it in a web browser. So with that being said, would you mind playing me in a game of Space War?
Good luck.
All right, so here we go. My first time playing Space War with Mr. Steve Russell. Russell was right when he said that the focus of this game was more about tactics rather than shoot 'em up. I'd have to keep my wits about me in order to survive. Each player controls a ship that is gravitating towards a star. The version that Russell and I are playing, if you touch the star, you'll randomly warp to another location on the screen. But in some parts of the game, the star will make your ship explode. The main controls are rotating your ship clockwise and counterclockwise, using your thrust to propel your ship in the direction you're facing, and firing your torpedo to try and hit the other player. While the main goal may be to blow up the other player's ship, you can put yourself at a major disadvantage by just firing off torpedoes at will, as there's only a certain amount you can shoot each round. There's also the hyperspace button, which will teleport your ship to somewhere else on the screen. It could be helpful in a bind, but with each time you use it, your chances of your ship randomly exploding increase. Orbit is also a major tactical point to get the hang of, as you can, depending on your entry to the star's gravitational pull, use the star's gravity to propel you in a given direction. While this game is incredibly tactics-based and has a learning curve, for myself that learning curve was losing to Russell, you can get the hang of it. By the end of our session, I had even beaten Russell a few times at his own game. But in the end, it isn't about who's more tactically capable than the other. It's about learning how to fly a spaceship, and that's the whole reason Russell invented this game in the first place. And thanks to Space War, I've learned way more about flying a spaceship than I ever would have. I hope you learned something too, and I can't wait to explore more with you next time, right here on VG 101. Good day, class. You know, I enjoyed our field trip to go play Space War so much that I decided to take us on another field trip. This time we'll be visiting a private collector in Cincinnati, Ohio to take a look at the very first arcade game, Computer Space. When we talk about how influential Space War was, we don't need to look any further than Computer Space. The game was created by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney to be a coin-operated version of Space War. The two recognized that many people kept coming back to play Space War, and because of this, people may come back to play other games again and again. If people are willing to spend their time to come back and repeatedly play your game, they may be willing to spend their money as well. They weren't the only pair to have this idea, as Bill Pitts and Hugh Tuck developed a very similar arcade game called Galaxy Game with the exact same theme in mind. To make some real money off of computer space, Bushnell partnered with Nutting Associates to mass manufacture game cabinets, and nearly 1,500 were sold.
I was on Facebook somewhere around October of 2014, and I saw on a video arcade game page that I was on, buying, selling, that there was a computer space for sale in St. Louis, Missouri. So I contacted the guy immediately, and he said he wanted $2,000 for the machine, and I said, I'll take it. And then he messaged me back a little bit later, and he said, I'd really like to get $3,000 out of the machine. So I said, okay, I'll take it. It's the only game I kept. I had about 100 machines in my personal collection. It's just it looks like a piece of art. It's beautiful, and I believe it's an integral part of our pop culture history. It's the first commercially sold arcade game.
Computer Space did its part to kick off arcade gaming, but how does it hold today? Well, it's certainly designed to look like something from outer space. Let's just hope the controls aren't too alien to grasp.
You control a rocket ship that is engaged in a battle with two flying saucers. Much like Space War, your controls consist of rotating your ship clockwise or counterclockwise, using thrust to propel yourself in a given direction, and the fire missile button to shoot down the saucers. You can even use your rotating buttons to curb your missile after you fire to hit a tricky target. There is a counter that goes up to 99, and the goal is to have more points than the flying saucers by the time the count is finished. If you don't, it's game over. But if you do, you get to play an extra round. However, sometimes when you get to the extra round, the display may change. If you get more than 9 points, your points may be labeled as a number of different things depending on the cabinet you're playing. In my case, I get some weird symbol, but in other cases, the number will change to letters or just simply count up to 15. At a certain point, your score will inevitably roll over back to 0, and if the counter runs out now, you end up losing.
The game is a little complex to grasp, but nothing too crazy. Unfortunately for Bushnell and Dabney, that's exactly how people perceived it though.
Although the game made more than $1 million, a financial success for Nutting Associates, it wasn't as successful as they had hoped for. Because of the relatively low number of cabinets that were sold, and the fact that people didn't really like it that much, the first arcade game has fallen into obscurity, and not many working cabinets are still around, let alone ones that are playable at an arcade.
While Computer Space didn't start the arcade craze, it did start the arcade movement. And because of that, we'll be taking a look at a lot more early arcade games very soon, right here on VG 101.
Oh, hey there, class. You just got me putting some grades in on my old Apple IIe. It's not much compared to computers these days, but it's got some pretty cool games on it. You know what? How about we have an impromptu class? I think I know just the game that I'd like to cover. In the mid-19th century, hundreds of thousands of people living in the United States traveled westward across the country. The people who were moving west had various different reasons for emigrating. Some were fur traders, some were missionaries, some were looking to get involved in the California gold rush, and others just sought a new life. There were multiple paths that guided settlers to the west, but the most well-known was the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was a nearly 2,000-mile path stretching from Independence, Missouri to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. It was a very important part of the history of the western expansion of settlers in the U.S., so important that an interactive game that educated schoolchildren about the trail was made over 100 years later. In 1971, Don Rawich, a student teacher in history at a Minneapolis middle school, was tasked with creating an interactive assignment to teach his students about the Oregon Trail. He initially came up with a board game that would deal with what supplies you take to begin with, random events, and so forth, and was set on that idea until telling his roommates about his assignment. His roommates were Bill Heineman and Paul Dillenberger, who both had a background in math and programming.
They pitched that the idea would work well as a computer game, since the computer could create the random events better and work to program the game on the school's HP 2100 minicomputer. The HP 2100 was a computer that was connected to a teleprinter. What you typed would end up coming out as paper, meaning that the original 1971 version of the Oregon Trail was entirely text-based. The game was a success as many students thoroughly enjoyed it. They enjoyed it so much that Rawitsch decided to keep the game by printing out copies of the source code and then deleting the program from the computer when his semester as a student teacher came to an end. 3 years later, Rawitsch was hired by Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, or MECC, at an entry-level position. MECC had a higher-end computer system that could be accessed by schools across the entire state of Minnesota and was looking to add more educational content that could be accessed by Minnesota students. When Rawitsch learned of this, he petitioned to add his game to the mainframe, and after reworking the source code to add in some more realistic updates than he had in the original version, the game was added in 1975. This mainframe version of the Oregon Trail became so popular that MECC realized that they could profit from it. In the early 80s, schools across the country started adopting Apple II computers for educational purposes, so MECC developed a floppy disk version of the game, which added graphical capabilities instead of just being a type-based game, and began to sell them across the country. Across the various versions of the game, it sold 65 million copies. Unfortunately, what that means is that the 5 1/4-inch floppy disk that everyone's familiar with is not the original version of the game, and since the program was taken off the HP 2100 computer, there's no real way to play the original. But the Apple II version is the one that made it famous, so I feel it's just as good. Just keep in mind that even this primitive computer is light years ahead of what the original would be. But enough talk, let's pop this thing in. The game is pretty basic as computer games are concerned. You have options for different commands you can put in to say how you want to progress the game and see how that plays out. To start, you choose who you want to play as. Your options are the banker, the carpenter, and the farmer. The only difference between these options is the banker starts out with more money, the carpenter has less, and the farmer has the least. But in keeping with historical accuracy, the West needed more carpenters and farmers than they did bankers. So beating the game as a carpenter gets you double the points, and beating the game as the farmer gets you triple the points. After that, you name the members of your group and choose what month you want to leave. The month is important because it determines the various effects weather will have on you depending on if it's the summer or the winter. Your journey starts in Independence, Missouri, where you start off buying equipment. The amount of oxen you have determines how fast you go on the trail. Your party needs food and clothing to survive. You may use bullets to hunt, and you can buy extra parts for your wagon in case something breaks. Once that's finished, you're off. Now you have to decide how your party is going to get along. There are 3 different paces you can set your wagon on: steady, strenuous, and grueling. The harder the pace, the faster you travel, but also the worse your party's health ends up being. You also need to set the use of rations for your party between filling, meager, and bare bones. The worse the rationing, the more health risks your party has, but you save food. Both the pace and rations can be changed as you go along. While traveling the trail, you hit a multitude of landmarks. The main ones that you need to deal with are forts, where you can spend money to get more supplies, and rivers that you need to cross. When you get to a river, you have a couple options as well. You can ford the river, which basically just means walking your wagon through it. You can caulk the wagon shut and float it across, or you can pay a guide to get you to the other side of the river. I say, if you have the money, almost always go for the guide, because if the game randomly decides that you don't make it across the river when you choose to ford or caulk, you lose a lot of supplies. Speaking of random events, there's a lot that are thrown at you that hinder your progress. Oxen can get lost or injured, thieves can come in the middle of the night to steal your supplies, and your party can even suffer broken limbs or diseases such as cholera and dysentery. And if you don't know what dysentery is, well, you're gonna crap your pants to death whenever I tell you. Throughout the path, you can also use your bullets to hunt for food, which pulls up a little shooting minigame. But for the sake of at least trying to keep in tune with the original 1971 game, I'm not going to use it. However, the 1971 game did keep hunting in mind, except instead of shooting bullets, you type POW or BANG. If you type the word fast enough, you'd end up getting a certain amount of food, so that's pretty neat. Once you get to Fort Laramie, it's time to flip the disc over and keep going. I should probably mention that when you're at landmarks, it's always a good idea to talk to people. They can give you tips on how to navigate certain parts of the trail, and if you're out of money but have a certain overabundance of supplies, you can always try to trade with people. The last leg of the trip takes you to the Dalles, where when you progress, you either pay a fee to go on the next path, or you float your wagon down a river and play a fun minigame. Unfortunately, I can't show you the minigame because every time I tried to take this path, my game would freeze. But luckily, I chose the banker so we can just buy our way into Oregon. At the end of the game, you reach the Willamette Valley, the finishing line for many 19th century settlers who took this very trail.
The Oregon Trail wasn't just educational, it was also fun and innovative in every iteration of its life. Hopefully you guys learned something today, and I'll see you next time right here on VG 101. But wait, forgot to show you what happens when you die.
If all your party members succumb to illness, you end up with this screen of a gravestone. See? Here lies Elijah.
Wait, I can write my own epitaph too. What should I write? I know. Good day, class. There have been a lot of firsts in this series. First video game, first arcade game. I feel like we should tackle another first. Today we'll be discussing the very first home video game console.
Engineer Ralph Baer spent his time in the 1950s as a military contractor focusing on electrical engineering. The monitors he used inspired him to come up with something that could hook up to a television that would be interactive, rather than just tuning into television stations. Through the 1960s, Baer built many prototypes to implement his ideas for interactions with your television sets, the most famous of which being his Brown Box. In 1969, he pitched the idea of and demonstrated a ping pong game on the Brown Box to the electronics company Magnavox. Magnavox went through with redesigning the Brown Box into the Magnavox Odyssey, and it was ready to be sold by 1972.
The Magnavox Odyssey was the very first video game console ever made, but with that prestige of being first, there were a lot of things that didn't really get tested in terms of marketing this product to a consumer or in terms of preserving it. To put it shortly, there are a lot of conditions that need to be met in order to effectively play this console today.
For starters, the console would connect to your TV via a game cord that has this odd end to it. That end would plug into a switcher box that would screw onto the back of the TV and connect to your console and your cable wire, so you could easily switch between playing games and watching your nightly shows. However, some of these switcher boxes are hard to find, and even if I had one, a TV from the 70s and 80s with the ability to have the box screwed into is even harder to find. I happen to have an older TV that would work, except for another obstacle that comes with this console, the game overlays. The Magnavox Odyssey didn't have graphics like you've come to know and love about video games today, so it used these overlays to give you a better idea of what the game you're playing should look like. The reason this is an issue for this TV is that they have specific sizes. Your TV either needs to be 18 to 21 inches for the small overlays or 23 to 25 inches for the big overlays. Even if you happen to have a TV with those specifications that is modern, you can't use that either because it must be a CRT TV. You know that static that comes off of the CRT? That's what holds the overlay in place on the screen. Using a CRT TV from the 90s and early 2000s is easier to find, but what about the switcher box? Well, you're going to have to modify the game cable. If you cut off one end and strip the plastic back, you'll find the copper that allows the video signal to travel from the console to the TV. What you need to do is solder that copper to an RCA adapter, and then connect that RCA adapter to a coax adapter. Connect that coax adapter to the coax input on the back of your TV, and you are finally in business. As long as the picture comes up. There's a good chance that the picture will be visible, but very screwed up, even though everything is connected correctly. And there's a way to fix it that requires getting inside the guts of the Odyssey. If you open it up, you'll find a couple of little discs that can control the vertical and horizontal frequency of the video signal. Just adjust them until the picture comes up is the best advice that I can give.
Now that everything has been adjusted and things are set up correctly, it's time to play the Odyssey. Except, well, there's just one more problem. All the games are two-player. I have a feeling this problem will be just a little easier to fix. Can I get a volunteer for the class, please? Yes, you! You'll do fine, come on.
What's your name, son? Logan. Nice to meet you, Logan. Are you ready to play some Magnavox Odyssey?
Well, I came up here, didn't I?
Shut up and come on.
So I know that the overlays are the graphics, but where are the games?
Oh, well, the games are these little numbered cards right here. Each card corresponds to a different game that operates the Odyssey in a different way. Here, let's pop in card number 1. This is the basic Odyssey game, Table Tennis.
Wait. Isn't this just Pong?
Nope. In fact, this is the game that inspired Pong. But we'll get to that in a later video.
So what's the difference?
Classic Pong only allows for vertical movement, which you could do with this knob. But on the Odyssey, you can also move horizontally. Unlike Pong that will hit the ball at a different angle depending on what part of the paddle is hit, all the curving on the ball is done using the English control.
So what's this reset button for?
The reset button? That's to serve the ball. Essentially, this game was made to get you used to the Odyssey controls, so there's no real reason to keep score. But if you want to, keep it in your head or a piece of paper because it won't keep score for you.
So this seems pretty basic, but when do the overlays come in?
Well, this is actually the only game that doesn't require an overlay, but let's move on to card 2 and check out some of the games on there. Card 2 changes the programming to where there's no ball, so we just move our characters around on the screen.
How is 2 squares moving around the screen with no ball supposed to be fun?
With the overlays, of course. The first one we've got is a skiing game. In this game, you move your character through the different slopes from the starting line to the finish line, all while trying to stay within the dotted lines at all times. There are 2 different ways to play each trail with 2 players. You can score your run on points, losing points whenever you light a gate, touch a tree, or hit a mountain, or a timed run where you add time for hitting those same obstacles, or getting disqualified for hitting the mountain. The game cards don't have to be switched out for every single game either. Game Card 2 also lets us play Simon Says.
Oh, I think I'm getting it now. Simon Says go off the screen.
Well, hold on, Logan. That's not quite how you play this version of the game. We need the Simon Says card deck. We each alternate drawing a card on the count of 3. We race to that area on the overlay, and whoever ends up with the most cards at the end of the deck is the winner.
That's not very much like Simon Says. Wouldn't we need someone to say where to go and one of us lose because they didn't say Simon Says?
Well, you know, you're absolutely right. We do need a third person. Would anyone else from the class like to join us? What, seriously? No one? Okay, well, you know what? Logan's getting extra credit for this.
Nice.
Well, I guess we should move on to game card number 3 and play a little bit of tennis.
Didn't we already play table tennis though? What's the difference?
Well, it starts with the game card. As you can see, there isn't a line in the middle this time. The overlay is meant to simulate an actual tennis court, so we have to play by the actual tennis rules. We have to serve from one corner to the other for a serve to count. We can't let the ball go out of bounds, and we keep score in terms of 15, 30, 40 in game. First player to win 6 games wins a set, and first to win 2 sets wins the match. There's also hockey on game card 3. To play this one, we start at the center of the ice and do a face-off.
Sweet! That's 1 point for me.
Oh, not exactly. You see, with hockey, we have to be on our opponent's side of the ice to be able to make the shot. If the puck goes off of the screen above the goal, we face off here, and below the goal, we face off here. From here, I'm able to try to score by using the English control to curve the puck. It can go straight in, or it can go off the board by going off the bottom or top of the screen and curving into the goal. You are allowed to try to defend, but if you go into your own goal, that's a foul. When that happens, you're only allowed to use one hand on your controller for the next 2 plays. Speaking of plays, the game consists of 3 periods, and each period consists of 20 plays.
Does this thing have any games that aren't sports related?
Absolutely. The Odyssey was designed as a total play and learning experience for all ages. So how about we learn a little bit of math in a game called Analogic? This game will test your mental wit as we try to traverse space. Me going from planet even to odd, you from planet odd to even.
Seems simple enough.
Not in the slightest. You see, I'll start moving to number 8, since it's even. You'd now have to add my number with the number you choose to move to make an odd number. When it's my turn again, I add the number you move to the number I need to move to make an even number.
That's just simple math. I don't see the issue here.
Well, the issue happens whenever it's time for us to find each other's planets. Until we're within 3 columns of each other, we need to transmit a signal to know where to go. That is accomplished by bouncing the ball as a signal back and forth. Also, if you miss your opponent with a signal, you have to go back a space. And your opponent gets a red chip, which allows them to move diagonally.
Okay, wow. This got really complicated really fast.
I told you it was going to test your wit. We could even complicate it more by adding in an extra rule. If the light bounces back and forth 4 times before you make your move, you lose your turn. Not so hard when we're far away, but once we get close, that light is going to start bouncing fast. But whenever we do get to the middle, the light goes away for the remainder of the game, and passing through the planets gives you an extra diagonal move.
Well, at least it can't get more complicated than this, and it's not sports.
Oh, you are about to be disappointed, because we're about to play football, and football requires not only game card 3, but 4? A bunch. A bunch. Like, seriously, Logan, I mean a bunch of these game card decks and a game board.
Pardon my French, Professor, but omelette du fromage.
That's the appropriate reaction, honestly. Game card 3 is for passing and kicking plays, while game card 4 is for running plays. You can tell a tackle happens with game card 4 because one of the players disappears if the players touch. We flip a coin to see who chooses whether to kick or receive first. If the receiver misses the ball, it's considered a touchback and the game starts on the 20-yard line. If the receiver catches the ball, then they get to run it back. But first, the kicker must draw a kicker card to determine the yardage, plus roll the dice to figure out how much further back the ball went off the kick due to wind. This all determines what yardage the ball is actually caught at, and then we have to calculate the run back. The receiver will roll the dice and from there figure out how many yards they were able to carry the ball. If they roll a number that corresponds to an X, that's considered a breakaway run, with the receiver rolling the dice again and then multiplying that number by 5 to find the yardage. All changes in yardage is shown with these markers on the game board, showing where the ball is and where the first down line is.
My brain hurts.
We haven't even gotten to the plays yet. With our play cards, the offense puts 1 card face down corresponding to a running play or passing play or a punt. The defense will do the same to try to counter the offense. We then flip our cards over, and if the defense picks the same card as the offense, then the defense has the chance to make the offense suffer a penalty. But let's explain how the plays work first. The running play has the offense in the line of scrimmage and the defense a block away. Until the offense says hike, both players should not have their hand on the horizontal movement button. Either keep it on the table or on your head. If the offensive player gets around the defensive player, it is a successful running play. When that happens, the offense will take a card from the run deck that will determine how many yards you move up. The place in which your character is on the screen after getting past the defense determines what number on the card is your yard increase. If a breakaway card is drawn, the offense rolls the dice and multiplies that number by 5 to determine yardage. Going out of bounds results in a 5-yard penalty, and touching the other player means the defense got the tackle. If the defense did not pick up the running card before the play happened, then it's just a down. But if they did pick the running card, the offense then takes a penalty. Defense will roll the dice and find the corresponding number that either sends the offense back some yards, or rolling the number that corresponds to X results in a fumble with the defense recovering the ball. The passing play starts with the offense in the line of scrimmage, the ball is thrown using the reset button, and the defense can only move vertically to block the pass. If the pass successfully goes past the defense, a card is drawn from the pass deck, which will give you the increase in yards. If a bomb card is drawn, it has the same effect as a breakaway card for running. If the ball bounces off the defense and the correct card wasn't picked, it's an incomplete pass. If the correct card was picked, the penalty is paid by rolling the dice with an X, resulting in an interception. There's also the punt, which plays the same way as a passing play. If the punt goes past the receiver, there is no run back, and the kicker will pick a card from the punt deck to determine yardage. Then, of course, the dice are rolled to calculate win. If the punt is caught, the receiver rolls the dice and reads the results in the punt run back row with an X, resulting in a breakaway. It's also possible to go for a field goal at any point within 60 yards of the goal you were going to. Just roll the dice and read whether or not your field goal made it depending on how far back you are. A plus is a successful field goal, and a 0 is an unsuccessful field goal with the opposition taking over at the 20. There are also 5-yard penalties for passing the line of scrimmage before the ball is hiked, or attempting a play with the wrong game card in. The game consists of 4 quarters, 20 plays each, and in the last 4 plays of each quarter, you can go for a bomb maneuver. A passing play is implemented with a successful attempt resulting in a dice roll times 5 to determine yardage, and an unsuccessful play results in an interception and a breakaway run by the opposition that results in a dice roll 5 times over!
I will pay you my tuition 5 times over if we can go to another game, please!
Okay, how about something a little simpler to understand? Let's play some cat and mouse.
Yes.
The left player starts on the cat's head as the cat, and the right player starts as the mouse. The mouse is trying to get around the cat to get to the bottom right corner. Neither player is allowed to touch the blue squares. They are supposed to be furniture. There are some stickers we can put on the overlay, but truthfully, I don't want to ruin the stickers. Each block would correspond to the number on a sticker across and down, with the sum being the score the mouse gets when they are eventually caught by the cat. If the mouse makes it all the way to the corner, that's 30 points. Each player gets 3 tries at being the mouse, and we can also play a variant of this with every odd numbered block not counting for any points at all.
This is definitely a lot better than football. Are there any other games this simple?
Well, that's sort of a complicated question to answer. Some of them are simple, some are not, but how about we just move on to our next one, Haunted House. One player starts off as the detective, and the other player is the ghost. At the beginning, the ghost will look through the deck of clue cards and go hide in one of the clues. They'll disappear by taking the detective's controller and running into the ghost, making them disappear. The detective is then returned to the front door. The ghost is helping the detective find all the clues by calling out the next clue the detective needs to go to. You can tell you found the clue when it illuminates on the overlay. If you go to the wrong clue, you skip any clues that you missed by doing that, and if you illuminate any windows, you lose the last clue you found. Once the detective gets to the clue right before the ghost hits the reset button, pops out and yells, "Boo!" Yes. Boo. The detective then needs to maneuver around the ghost without touching them. If they do touch the ghost, they lose half the clues they've collected. Once the detective gets to the note on the 3rd floor, they draw a secret message card that either takes a clue away from them, gives them a clue, or sends them back to another clue location to traverse the haunted house from there again. At the end of the house, the detective finds the treasure, and the amount of clues they ended up with is tallied.
At least this is less complicated than football, but I'm kind of missing the action of the sports games. Is there any other more actiony games?
Yeah, in fact, how about we play a shoot 'em up game? Let's pop in game cartridge 5. And play Submarine. The programming is changed on this one to make one of the players disappear when they are hit by a ball, or in this case, torpedo. One player stays on the left side firing torpedoes while the other player navigates the path. Each time the right player is hit, they hit the reset button and keep going along the path. The amount of ships sank by the time the ship gets to the end of the path determines the submarine's player's points for the round.
Who would have thought I would enjoy shooting my professor so much?
I'm flattered. Anyway, this is the only game that's on card 5, so let's move on to card 6 and gamble with a game of roulette. Probably not best to tell the board and regents about this game, okay?
Okay.
We are going to need a couple peripherals, like we're going to need this board, this board, whew. And we're going to need some chips, And some cash. You ready to gamble?
Here you go.
Nice. Alright, let's get to the game. The programming is altered by this card by allowing the light to be randomized. Essentially, we bet with chips on where the light will land and put those chips on the game board betting on red, black, a certain number, a row of numbers, evens, odds, etc. The reset button is held down while the horizontal and vertical knobs are moved around, scrambling the memory. The reset button is then released, and the light then moves onto the screen on its own, finding its place on the roulette, determining whether or not we made money back on our bets.
We aren't using real money though, are we?
No, of course not. That would be absurd. Why would we use real money, Logan? Of course we aren't.
Right.
Now, let's finish up our education on the Odyssey with a good old education game. States. We randomize the light the same way as with roulette and try to identify what the state is that the light landed on. The states cards help us determine whether or not we were right. If you are right, you get to keep the card. If you land on a state that has already been taken, you can challenge for that state by answering one of the questions related to that state on the state card. All this can be found in this handy-dandy Affairs of States booklet. If the light lands on one of the Great Lakes and the correct lake is named, that player gets a free state card that cannot be challenged for. First player to get either 15, 25, or 35 states wins.
You know, I didn't really expect to learn this much from video games, especially the first video game console. I mean, we learned about sports, geography, and even math. You know, they really hit the nail on the head when they said this was both a play and learning experience.
Just exactly. You know, people are always dogging on educational games, but they fail to realize that the entire first generation of video games was pretty much about educating people. There is so much we can learn from video games, and there's always more to learn. So you know what, Logan? It was great having you in class today. And the rest of the class, I hope to see you guys next time when we tackle more right here on VG 101. Is it crooked?
I thought I was left-handed. Alright.
Good day, class. I'm your host, the VG Professor. On today's episode, we're visiting the 1984 arcade in Springfield, Missouri to take a look at arguably the most influential video game of all time, Pong. After Computer Space's relatively unsuccessful run, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney decided to start their own company, Atari. Still believing that there was money to be made in video games, Bushnell supposedly went to a Magnavox Odyssey demonstration in Burlingame, California, where he played table tennis, and started to wonder how he could improve it. Bushnell hired engineer Alan Alcorn to try to create a game of electronic tennis, which evolved into Pong. When the cabinet was released in 1972, it became a great success and became more than just a game, but an iconic, cultural phenomenon that is still referenced throughout media today. Unfortunately, this popularity also caught the attention of Ralph Baer and Magnavox, who filed a lawsuit on Atari for infringing on Baer's patents, which resulted in Bushnell settling with Magnavox outside of court. Despite the legal issues, Pong had an incredible amount of success and is credited with starting the arcade craze. But how does it hold up today, and how does it differ from the Odyssey's table tennis? It was 2 players, so I think I'm gonna need another volunteer from the class. Hey, you! Come on up here! What's your name?
James.
Nice to have you here, James. Are you ready to play some Pong?
Of course.
Awesome, let's head over to the cabinet now. As Atari did not initially file a patent for the technology used in the game, clones of the Pong cabinet were made throughout 1973 by multiple companies. The one here at 1984 is actually called Winner and is developed by Midway. And other arcades even had their own special edition Pong cabinet that they created, like this one here at Galloping Ghosts. Both players move their respective knobs clockwise and counterclockwise, causing their corresponding Pong paddles to move up and down. The goal is to get the ball past the other player to score a point and to use your paddle to block the ball from going past you. A distinct difference between Pong and the Magnavox Odyssey's table tennis is that there is no English control. Instead, the ball will be hit at a specific angle depending on where the ball hits on the paddle. With each respective hit, the speed of the ball gets faster, making for some pretty hectic back and forth between two skilled players. Once one player reaches a certain amount of points, the game ends. I've seen various Pong cabinets go anywhere from 9 to 15 points.
That was great. I can see why people in the early 70s loved this so much. I just hate that we have to come to an arcade every time we want to play.
Well, you see, James, lucky for you, Atari came up with a solution to this back in 1975.
What the? How did we get here? And why are you in my house?
Well, you wished you could play Pong in the home, right? So I brought us here.
You grant wishes. Are you magic?
No. That would be contrived and idiotic. Now, let's play some home Pong.
Atari struck an exclusive deal in 1975 with Sears to sell the Sears Telegames Pong console, which struck another goldmine with this game. Over 150,000 units were sold in that year's holiday season alone. And then, of course, came the clones. Home Pong console clones were made by multiple companies throughout the back half of the 1970s. These clones also consisted of different setups, different variations of controllers, and of course, different variations of the game itself. The Sears Telegames Pong console doesn't have controllers like later clones, instead you move the knobs on top of the console. The game displays much like the arcade cabinet, except it's in color for those with a color TV. It plays the exact same, and this version ends when the score hits 15.
So there you have it, all the fun of Pong right here in your home. James, I want to thank you for joining me today, and I also want to thank you for not calling the police or basically invading your home.
You know, I'm not even that mad about it. Just don't do it again. Does this mean I get an A for the class?
Oh, it sure does. And the rest of you can also get A's this class if you continue to join us right here on VG 101.